Good morning. I'm glad you could be with me today as we continue our Unfolding the Word studies. Over the last couple days, we've begun looking at the fourth chapter now of First Peter in our extended study of First Peter. I'm going to pick up our reading today in the fourth chapter in verse 3. For the time that is past suffices for doing what the Gentiles want to do, living in sensuality, passions, drunkenness, orgies, drinking parties, and lawless idolatry. With respect to this, they're surprised when you do not join them in the same flood of debauchery, and they malign you. But they will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead, that though judged in the flesh the way people are, they might live in the spirit the way God does. We've been talking about the applications of the lifestyle of the gospel and the wonder of the gospel. And we've been seeing the issue emerges in the fourth chapter, the choice that we make on how we will live our lives in this world. And the believer is being addressed here, not the unbeliever. How and for who will we live our lives? And we saw how fundamentally that reduces down to a fairly simple, straightforward choice between two options. We can live our life in this world as a redeemed child of God for our own purposes and will, or we can live our life in this world as a redeemed child of God for the will of God. But then God cautions us and he says, listen, if you choose to live for your will, you will end up squandering and wasting your life. Yesterday, we talked about how to not have that happen and how to be sure that we're not wasting our lives, ensuring that our lives really will matter and make a difference that we've been alive. And we saw three characteristic attitudes and perspectives. He says, first of all, make sure you're arming yourself with Christ's attitude towards suffering, because frequently it's the fear of suffering that keeps us from surrender and letting Jesus be the Lord of our life. We also talked about choosing to cease from sin and live a holy life. And in so doing, we begin to discover God's purposes for leaving us in this world. Of course, all of that ties back to living as lights in the darkness counterculturally. And finally, he said, make sure your attitude is that you want to live the rest of your life for the God's will, not your own will. And we talked about how even as a believer, we can still be living our life for our will, being in this driver's seat of our life, making decisions. Even if we're giving God some parts of our life, we're still ultimately in the driver's seat. And God says, listen, I want you to present your body as a living sacrifice to me. Romans 12:1. And in fact, it's the only way that Romans 12:2 is realizable. He says, don't be conformed to this world, the mentalities of the culture around you, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Presenting our bodies a living sacrifice, which means to let Jesus be the Lord, sitting in the driver's seat of your life, guiding your life, living for him. And don't be conformed. But if you're being conformed, he can't be in the driver's seat. You follow the distinction? Okay. Well, beginning in verse 3 now, we begin to learn more about the rebel's pathway to a squandered life, a pathway far too often that the believer takes. Here's the point. The world that we live in, the ESV translates it Gentile, but the idea is pagan. The world that we live in, the culture we live in, no matter where we live in this world, is a pagan culture. It is a Gentile culture. It is a culture lived in opposition to God, in rebellion against him and his purposes. The people, therefore, in the culture in which we find ourselves, no matter where we live in this world, those people will be living their lives driven by a very different set of priorities and values. One of the consequences of that is that those who are the exile aliens redeemed by the Lord Jesus Christ, and God scatters us into these cultures, we are on a collision course inevitably with this conflict in values and priorities. Romans 12:2, as I already said, commands us not to conform to those values and priorities of the culture that we find ourselves in. And yet, far too many believers, redeemed children of God, choose to live the pagan way. That's far too often the choice they make. And the consequence of that choice is that while temporarily it might seem to be easier to conform to the culture, it ultimately squanders their life, as the C.T. Studd quote was that I gave you yesterday. Only one life 'twill soon be past. Only what's done for Christ will last. What will be the fruit of your life in this world? It can be nothing in zero, or it can make a difference that you've been alive. That will require letting Jesus be Lord. Well, what are some of these pagan alternatives? What are some of these world's mindset of values and priorities that are driving the culture ultimately, and that God says, I don't want my redeemed children of God to reflect these? Let's begin to look at those. Things that are living and doing what the Gentiles choose to do. Well, the first of these things that we saw in verse 3 is that they are choosing to live in sensuality. The Greek word translated sensuality here means excesses, extremism. Can mean indecencies, but it doesn't have to have a moral connotation to it. It has more to do with just excess and extremism, sensuality. It describes an individual who is living and driven by a desire of the shock value of their choices in other people. Now, that shock value might be seen in their dress, it might be seen in their actions, it might be seen in their language. I don't know all the ways it'll show up, but the idea is they live for that. They derive a pleasure from the shock value of their life on other people. That's not how God's called us to live. God has not called us to such excess and extremism. Easy to be called into it and to be conformed to it. He also says that they choose not to be living in passions. The ESV translates it that way. The idea here is to be driven by lust. The Greek word translated by passions here is referring to strong sensual drives, strong sensual desires, usually sexual in nature, but not exclusively so. It describes an individual who, as an orientation of life, sees that the right response to such drives is to give them free rein. To refuse to deny these inner drives and allow them to express themselves. After all, if they're inner drives, they must be natural, and if they're natural, they must be okay. And of course, God says not everything that is an inner drive is a good thing. And not everything that's an inner drive is okay to let express itself. In fact, he goes far much more than that and describes much of what goes on in the human heart is sinful and destructive. And giving free rein to it's no solution. At any rate, within the culture, we find people living in passions as an orientation. He says some people are not only living in sensuality and passions, but they're living in drunkenness. Literally living overflowing with wine is the actual Greek here. And it means and describes the person who has dulled their senses through drink or other intoxicants. And in our culture today, of course, there's many intoxicants beyond drink, drugs of all forms, intoxicating things. Essentially, it describes an individual who is anesthetizing their self, their awareness of the hurts and responsibilities of life through the escapism of the drunkenness that they're permitting in their life. And he says that's the way people live. That's part of the way that Gentiles are choosing to live. It's what I don't want you to be doing. He says not only are they living in sensuality, living in passions, living in drunkenness, but they're also living in orgies. At least that's the ESV translation. Literally, the word translated orgies in this case refers to wild parties. Priority of life being the party mindset. It means an individual and describes an individual living for entertainment, living for fun. One of the scholars says it describes the condition of being amused to death, amused to anesthesia almost in your life. Instead of really living, you're pretend living by the entertainment and amusement value of activities. A lot of people live that way, driven by that. That's what they look forward to throughout the week, is the opportunity to party at some point, and in which case they dull their senses and live in that fashion. Living for entertainment. Well, all of these things, and there's more we'll look at tomorrow, Lord willing, are characteristics of the pagan alternative, living for ourselves, and we will end up conforming to them to the degree that Jesus is not Lord. Join me tomorrow as we continue to examine these things together that God is warning us against, because he cares about whether his redeemed children waste their life or live productively. God bless.